The Atlantic was dark and endless. Somewhere within that darkness, 50 ships moved in silence, scattered across waves that could swallow a man and leave no trace. Each night, another convoy vanished, swallowed not by the sea alone, but by something far more precise: mathematics of destruction. By the winter of 1941, the Battle of the Atlantic was reaching a crisis. German U-boats, Type 7 and Type 9, had turned the ocean into a hunting ground. Convoys coded HX and SC lost freighters faster than Britain could replace them. Coal, food, and oil sank beneath torpedo wakes that curved like signatures on water. Every message that reached the Admiralty carried the same refrain: ships missing, survivors few. The Royal Navy had sonar, then called ASDIC, but it could only hear what was already too close. Depth charges rumbled through the deep, blind, and hopeful. Admiral Sir Percy Noble studied a wall map pinned with red markers, each a sunken vessel. He murmured, "We're fighting ghosts." The room smelled of wet wool, ink, and fatigue. Dozens of minds searched for tactical answers, but none for patterns. It was around this time that a physicist named Patrick Blackett re-entered the war. He was 43, tall, sharp-eyed, a veteran of the First World War trenches, and a pioneer of cloud chamber physics. He had left Cambridge's laboratories to serve again, not as a sailor this time, but as something Britain had never formally deployed before: a scientist of war. Blackett had served briefly in naval gunnery research before the First War ended. He understood trajectories, probabilities, and the hidden order beneath chaos. Now he looked at shipping losses and saw equations, not tragedy, but he also knew equations could save lives if used correctly. He once said quietly to a colleague, "The ocean is large, but our mistakes are larger." He arrived in a world where admirals spoke in miles and knots, not variables and constants. The British war machine was immense, but coordination was drowning under information. Thousands of patrol reports, sonar logs, and after-action summaries were filed daily, yet no one read them as data. Blackett proposed a radical idea: analyze everything. Measure what worked and what didn't. Find patterns in the noise. To many in uniform, it sounded absurd. A captain from Coastal Command sneered, "You can't fight U-boats with sums." Blackett only replied, "Not yet." London in 1941 lived under blackout. Bombs fell at night. Equations rose by day. In a narrow office near Whitehall, Blackett began collecting reports from convoys returning to Liverpool and Halifax. He noted where ships sailed, when they were attacked, how escort vessels maneuvered, and how deep the charges detonated. Every detail mattered. Even failure was data. He soon realized that no single admiral possessed the whole picture. Each command guarded its own charts. So he built one master map stretching from Greenland to Gibraltar, filled with colored pins that changed daily. To him, the ocean looked less like geography and more like probability space. Across the Atlantic, American officers wrestled with the same nightmare. Convoy On 67 lost 9 ships in 1 week. Sonar pings echoed uselessly. Depth charges exploded in empty water. War at sea was statistical before it was visible. Back in London, Blackett met with officials of the Royal Air Force Coastal Command. They debated how many aircraft were needed to cover a convoy. Traditional logic said, the more, the better. Blackett disagreed. He argued that efficiency had a curve, that doubling planes did not double safety. It was a simple statement, but it hinted at something revolutionary. War could be optimized. He began assembling a small circle of scientists, physicists, biologists, even a zoologist. They joked that they were a circus, and the name stuck: Blackett's Circus. They would later be known as the first operational research unit in history. Their task was to calculate how to kill submarines more effectively than admirals could guess. To understand the scale of the problem, they turned to the numbers. In early 1942, Allied losses exceeded 600,000 tons per month. For every U-boat destroyed, 5 new ones left German yards. The Atlantic had become a factory of disappearance. In the field, men saw only chaos, torpedoes, flames, survivors clinging to rafts. But in the Circus's basement office, each explosion became a point on a graph. And slowly, patterns began to appear. Certain escort formations suffered fewer losses. Certain depths yielded more kills. It was not luck. It was mathematics revealing the anatomy of survival. Yet few in command wanted to hear it. Data threatened tradition. An old commodore muttered, "Gentlemen, this is the Navy, not a classroom." Blackett didn't argue. He simply drew another curve. Outside the Admiralty, fog rolled over the Thames. Inside, equations glowed faintly under desk lamps. The scientist wrote late into the night, translating chaos into order, knowing that every corrected variable might save a convoy tomorrow. He calculated sonar detection ranges versus decibel loss in seawater. He compared the density of attacks to convoy spacing, and he began to see what no admiral could from a bridge. The war beneath the surface was governed by probability, not courage. Still, the ocean refused easy answers. Weather, noise, deception, all blurred the signal. Blackett realized he was fighting not only the enemy, but uncertainty itself. And in that uncertainty lay both danger and discovery. While U-boats prowled invisible beneath the Atlantic swell, Blackett's chalk traced their ghosts on land. Each sunk ship became a coordinate, each lost sailor a data point. It was a grim arithmetic, but the only kind the ocean respected. At the end of that winter, his first report reached the Admiralty. It was modest in tone, terrifying in implication. It showed that many convoy escorts were wasting ammunition at wrong depths, and that success increased not by brute force, but by precise spacing and timing. For the first time, the war at sea looked solvable. By then, the British public knew nothing of these experiments. To them, the Atlantic was still a graveyard. But in a quiet office near the Thames, a mathematician was reshaping that graveyard into a grid, one that could be measured, predicted, and eventually controlled. He leaned back, eyes on the map. There was no victory yet, only a direction. "If the ocean follows rules," he whispered, "then so must war." On that same map, he began to draw lines, not of ships, but of probabilities. The numbers would soon fight back. Patrick Blackett didn't fight with guns. He fought with graphs. He believed that behind every tragedy in the Atlantic lay a pattern waiting to be revealed. And to find it, he needed minds as restless as his own. In early 1942, the Admiralty sanctioned a small research team under his direction. It gathered in a narrow room beneath University College in London. There were physicists, biologists, and even one zoologist who specialized in population behavior. The officers upstairs mocked them and called the group Blackett's Circus. The nickname stayed, but the laughter didn't last. They began with chaos, thousands of patrol logs, hundreds of after-action reports. Each one was a fragment of confusion. But to Blackett, it was raw material for reason. He read each report line by line, noting the position of ships, time of attack, and results. Gradually, something emerged from the noise. He noticed that when aircraft attacked a U-boat within 15 seconds of sighting it, the chance of success doubled. After 30 seconds, the chance was cut in half. It was a small observation, but it changed everything. He summarized it in one line. Speed of decision is as vital as speed of aircraft. The Royal Air Force Coastal Command tested his idea. They adjusted patrol formations, altered flight paths, and shortened reaction times. Within weeks, U-boat sightings increased. Commanders didn't know why. They only knew it worked. The most unpredictable battlefield in the war was beginning to follow logic. But the deeper the circus went, the more uncomfortable the truths became. The Navy believed that depth charges should be dropped close together for maximum power. Blackett's team proved the opposite. Wide spacing covered more area and doubled the probability of a hit. The conclusion went against everything the officers had been taught. One of them shouted, "You're telling me less explosives mean more results?" Blackett answered quietly, "Only if you drop them where the enemy actually is." The tests in the Bay of Biscay confirmed it. A single destroyer, following the new pattern, destroyed a training target submarine on its first run. No one cheered. The results spoke for themselves. By mid-1942, Blackett's Circus was analyzing every aspect of anti-submarine warfare: convoy spacing, escort ratios, radar coverage. Even the paint on aircraft, whether matte or glossy, was measured for how it reflected sunlight. Every question was turned into an equation. Every equation revealed another truth. The most shocking discovery came from a simple comparison. Naval commanders believed that small convoys were safer because they were harder to find. Blackett proved the opposite. Large convoys lost a smaller percentage of ships because the same number of U-boats could only attack so many targets at once. It wasn't luck, it was geometry. The larger the group, the smaller the risk per ship. When the Admiralty reviewed the numbers, disbelief gave way to silence. Soon after, convoy policies changed. By the end of the year, the ocean's rhythm shifted. Britain was no longer scattering ships into the dark. It was learning to move them together, like a single organism. Still, not everyone approved. Every equation challenged pride. Every success rewritten in chalk threatened years of naval tradition. Some commanders called them men without salt, mocking the fact that none had ever served at sea. But their dry numbers were saving wet lives. At night, the team worked through air raids. The walls shook from bombs above, but the chalk never stopped moving. The blackboard filled with equations of detection range, acoustic reflection, and probability curves. To outsiders, it looked like mathematics. To them, it was survival. Among the circus members was a young statistician named E.J. Williams. He had once studied animal herds and predator movements. Now he applied those same models to U-boat wolf packs. Submarines, he said, hunted like wolves, in groups, striking in coordination. By mapping attacks and comparing timings, the team began to predict where the next pack would appear. It was the first time data outguessed the enemy. Convoys began to change course days before attacks were expected. Losses dropped. Morale rose. Mathematics had given the Navy foresight, a way to anticipate, not just react. But victory on paper came with a price in thought. Each report they studied listed ships sunk and lives lost. Each number had faces behind it. The deeper they understood, the heavier it felt. Blackett often paused at the blackboard. His team assumed he was checking his figures. He wasn't. He was thinking of what those figures meant. He told one colleague, "Every calculation means a life saved, but every calculation begins with one already lost." Outside, the Atlantic remained merciless. U-boats still surfaced under moonlight. Convoys still burned. But now, for the first time, the hunters were being hunted by logic. The circus began sending their results to field commanders in simplified charts. They translated complex formulas into clear, practical tables: how deep to drop charges, how far to space ships, when to turn sonar on and off. Captains received them with skepticism until they saw the results. Weeks later, reports arrived. More submarines sunk. Fewer convoys lost. The pattern was holding. The mathematician's invisible weapons were working. By the end of 1942, for the first time since the war began, merchant losses started to decline. It wasn't a dramatic turnaround, but it was real, measurable progress. And in a war measured in tonnage, progress was victory. Blackett remained cautious. Numbers were only guides, never guarantees. He told his team, "We may predict the sea, but we will never master it." The war, like the ocean, humbled everyone. That winter, the Circus turned its attention to sonar. They found that crews often silenced sonar to avoid detection. The data showed the opposite effect. Constant noise made submarines uncertain and harder to aim. Logic overturned instinct once again. Blackett presented the finding to a table of skeptical admirals. He spoke quietly, almost like a teacher. "Gentlemen," he said, "we are fighting probability itself. To win, we must stop fearing the numbers." No one answered. They simply nodded. From that day, orders changed. Sonar stayed on. Convoys sailed closer together, and slowly, invisibly, the war beneath the waves began to turn. One officer wrote later, "We stopped guessing. We started thinking." The mathematician had turned thought itself into a weapon. But the more victories they achieved, the heavier the silence grew. Each new theory was tested in battle. Each formula cost lives to prove. For every line of success, there was a line of loss. Blackett knew it, felt it, and carried it quietly. He was fighting two enemies now, the submarines outside and the conscience within. The ocean was teaching him that even truth had a price. The numbers had begun to fight back. Each number on his chart had a name. Each curve, each line, each point of data, a ship, a crew, a story. Patrick Blackett knew that better than anyone. He could feel it behind every equation. The more accurate the math became, the more real the war felt. By early 1943, the results of his work could no longer be denied. Convoy losses had fallen sharply. U-boats were still deadly, but their advantage was slipping. For the first time in the war, the Atlantic belonged not to luck or bravery, but to logic. But victory on paper came at a cost no one had prepared for. Each improvement meant a test. Each test meant men at sea, risking their lives to confirm the calculations. Blackett's equations had to be proven not in lecture halls, but in salt water, oil, and blood. He began to receive reports of destroyers that never returned, ships that followed his new spacing patterns, crews that had tried experimental tactics. Some were lost before they could even radio back. Their silence echoed louder than success. Blackett blamed himself. He didn't say it aloud, but his notes reveal the weight he carried. In the margin of one report, he scribbled only 4 words. Theory correct. Crew lost. He worked harder. He stopped leaving the office before dawn. He refused meetings, ignored fatigue, and filled his notebooks with revisions. The equations became endless, the chalkboards darker each night. He believed that somewhere, hidden in the data, was a way to stop the dying completely. But the ocean refused perfection. War does not reward balance, it consumes it. Every few days, the Admiralty sent him new casualty figures, ships sunk, men missing. Each set of numbers looked the same as the last. Only the names changed. He no longer read them all the way through. His colleagues noticed the change. The once energetic professor had grown quiet, almost mechanical. When someone congratulated him on the improved survival rate, he said, "Statistics don't bleed, people do." He wasn't trying to be poetic. He was simply tired of the arithmetic of death. The team around him felt it too. For every success the Circus achieved, another report reminded them of what it cost. The blackboard filled with variables that described destruction. Some nights they erased it all and started again, as if clearing the equations could clear their minds. But the data never stopped coming. And so, neither did they. In March 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic reached its turning point. The Allies had begun using improved radar and long-range patrol aircraft, guided by mathematical models from Blackett's team. The result was stunning. In 1 month alone, more than 40 German submarines were sunk. The hunters had become the hunted. The newspapers called it a triumph of technology. They printed photos of smiling sailors and spoke of scientific victory. But inside the Admiralty, the mood was quieter. The numbers that showed victory also showed loss. Thousands still missing, convoys still gone. The graphs rose on one side and fell on another. Blackett stopped keeping personal notes that spring. He no longer wrote about discoveries or results. He wrote only about patterns of noise, the limits of data, and the uncertainty of war. He began to question not the logic, but its purpose. He had always believed science existed to save lives. Now it was being used to take them faster, more efficiently, with better precision. That contradiction gnawed at him. His mind had turned the tide of battle, but his heart wondered if victory built on numbers alone could ever feel like peace. He was not alone in that thought. Many of the circus members shared it. They had seen what numbers could do, both the beauty of understanding and the horror of accuracy. They were mathematicians, not soldiers, yet they carried the same exhaustion as those on the front lines. Still, they continued. They worked through fatigue, fear, and moral doubt, because stopping, even for a day, meant more lives lost at sea. Logic, they realized, had become its own kind of duty. By mid-1943, the change was undeniable. Convoy losses dropped by half. U-boats were being sunk faster than Germany could replace them. The Royal Navy began to believe in the power of analysis. For the first time, science had become a weapon in its own right. But for Blackett, it was a bitter victory. He looked at the same maps that had once frightened him and felt nothing but fatigue. Where others saw progress, he saw ghosts. Red pins turned blue, lives turned into data points. He had won the argument but lost his peace. One evening, as he prepared another report for the Admiralty, a young assistant asked if he thought the war would soon be over. Blackett stared at the chart in front of him for a long time before answering. "Soon," he said, "but not for the sea. The sea never ends." The boy didn't understand. He wasn't supposed to. Blackett was speaking more to himself than anyone else. He had spent months watching the war transform from a struggle of ships to a contest of minds. The ocean, once an enemy, had become a mirror. That night, after everyone had left, he stayed alone in the office. He looked at the board filled with numbers, sonar ranges, probabilities, casualty ratios, and wiped it clean. The chalk dust hung in the air like smoke. For a moment, he felt the silence of the Atlantic inside those four walls. It was vast, endless, and heavy with memory. He thought of the men who had trusted his calculations, the captains who had followed his recommendations into battle, the ones who returned, the ones who didn't. He wondered whether they would forgive him for reducing courage to percentages. He sat down, folded his hands, and whispered to the empty room. "Numbers have no conscience. That part is still ours." When he left the office, dawn was breaking over London. The fog over the Thames glowed faintly, and for the first time in months, he didn't feel the weight of the equations, only their silence. Behind him, the walls of the Circus office were bare. No graphs, no formulas, only blank boards waiting for what came next. The victory they had built was real, but it came with an unseen cost, the quiet guilt of those who win by thinking rather than fighting. and somewhere far out on the Atlantic, beneath gray water and fading light, the ocean kept its own count of ships, of souls, and of what every equation had left behind. The war was turning. But for Patrick Blackett, the turning point was not triumph. It was the realization that every solution demanded a sacrifice. When the last U-boat went silent, the numbers finally stopped moving. The Battle of the Atlantic had turned. The hunters had become the hunted. And in that turning, a new kind of weapon was born, not made of steel or fire, but of reason. Patrick Blackett watched as the reports arrived. Convoys were crossing safely. Merchant ships that once vanished in the fog now reached their ports. The equations had worked. The mathematics of survival had defeated the mathematics of destruction. But victory did not bring celebration. It brought reflection. For years, Blackett had lived among figures and formulas, trying to predict chaos. Now, faced with success, he felt only quiet exhaustion. He had proven that the ocean could be measured, that probability could be used as a compass. Yet he also knew the cost of that knowledge. By late 1943, he was invited to advise other branches of the military. The air forces, the artillery, even logistics planners wanted his methods. They called it operations research. What began as one man's desperate attempt to stop ships from sinking had become a scientific revolution. Across Britain and the United States, new research groups sprang up overnight, all tracing their lineage back to Blackett's Circus. It was the birth of a discipline, the science of decisions under uncertainty. After the war, it would shape economics, transportation, and even space exploration. But in its beginning, it was born out of fear, death, and necessity. Blackett accepted the honors that followed, but never with joy. He returned to academic life at Manchester and later London, continuing his research in physics. In 1952, he received the Nobel Prize for his discoveries in cosmic rays, not for his wartime work. When asked about his contribution to the Battle of the Atlantic, he simply said, "It was a duty, not a triumph." He rarely spoke of those years. His colleagues recalled that when the subject of the war came up, he grew silent. Sometimes he would turn to the window and say, "We did what we had to, but the sea doesn't forgive. It only forgets for a while." For the men who served at sea, the change was undeniable. Convoys that once felt like moving coffins now had a rhythm, a logic, a plan. They called it Blackett's magic. But it wasn't magic. It was mathematics, transformed by necessity into survival. Those who lived through it never knew the names of the people who saved them. They never met the men and women who spent nights in a smoky London basement, turning fear into equations. They only knew that something invisible had shifted. Luck had been replaced by understanding, and that understanding had kept them alive. The legacy of that quiet transformation reached far beyond the war. The tools of operations research became standard practice in industries and governments worldwide. Airlines used it to plan routes. Hospitals used it to allocate resources. Even space agencies used it to calculate trajectories. The principles born from the chaos of the Atlantic now guided peacetime progress. But for Blackett, the legacy was never just technical. He believed that science carried moral weight. It could illuminate truth, but it could also strip it of humanity. In his later writings, he warned against what he called the illusion of control. He reminded readers that the same logic that saved ships could one day be used to destroy cities. He was right. Only 2 years after victory, the world entered the atomic age. And once again, the boundary between reason and ruin blurred. Yet amid all that, his wartime philosophy endured. The belief that knowledge itself is a form of courage. He had proven that intelligence could stand against chaos, that thought could fight back against fear. In an era defined by destruction, That was its own kind of heroism. The members of Blackett's Circus went on to shape post-war science. Many became leaders in government and research. Some never spoke publicly about their work again. They had seen too much. They had learned that even when numbers win, the soul of the calculation remains human. Years later, when historians asked how Britain managed to survive the darkest phase of the Atlantic War, one admiral answered simply, "Because we learned to count what mattered." Blackett never heard those words. He had already moved beyond the noise of war. He spent his final years teaching, always reminding students that equations were only tools. It was people who gave them meaning. He died in 1974, quietly, far from the ocean that had once defined his life. But his influence never faded. Every modern field that uses data to guide decisions, from economics to medicine, carries his fingerprint. Every graph, every model, every analysis owes something to the man who first proved that reason could change the course of history. And yet, for all the progress that followed, the question he wrestled with still lingers. Can understanding truly defeat chaos? Or does it simply reveal how deep chaos runs? The war had ended, but the ocean remained. It still moves with the same rhythm, hiding its own equations beneath the waves. Ships still cross it every day, guided by satellites and systems born from those wartime formulas. They are safer now, more efficient, more predictable, but they are still small against the vastness of the sea. In that sense, Blackett's work was never really finished. He didn't master the ocean. He merely taught humanity how to listen to it. Because in the end, that was his true achievement, not the victories, not the statistics, not even the birth of a new science. His legacy was the realization that even in war, reason can be an act of mercy. He had turned chaos into understanding, and understanding, at last, into peace.